Manhattan, New York City. October 2023. The rain hammered against the glass facade of the Meridian Tower like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry, each drop a messenger of the storm that had descended upon the financial district with biblical fury. In the marble lobby of one of the city's most prestigious buildings, where fortunes were made and lost with the stroke of a pen, a man in a burgundy uniform stood clutching an envelope so weathered it looked like it had survived a war. Marcus Webb had been the doorman at Meridian Tower for 32 years. He had opened doors for senators, CEOs, celebrities, and countless ambitious young professionals who climbed the corporate ladder one designer heel at a time. His uniform was always pressed, his brass buttons gleaming, his smile practiced and warm. But today, his hands trembled as they gripped the envelope, and his usually steady gaze was fixed on the revolving door with an intensity that made the security guard glance over twice. The envelope had arrived that morning in the strangest way. An elderly woman, dressed in clothes that belonged to another era, had appeared outside the building just after dawn. Marcus had noticed her through the glass, standing perfectly still in the rain without an umbrella, water streaming down her face like tears. When he'd rushed outside to help her, she'd pressed the envelope into his hands with fingers as cold as ice. "Find Victoria Ashford," the woman had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Give this to her today. Before 5 o'clock. Her destiny depends on it. And yours." Before Marcus could ask what she meant, before he could even get a proper look at her face, she had turned and disappeared into the morning mist, leaving him standing in the rain with an envelope addressed in fading ink to someone he knew all too well. Victoria Ashford. The name alone carried weight in these halls. At 38, she was the youngest senior vice president in the history of Ashford & Chin Investment Group, a firm her grandfather had co-founded 60 years ago. She was brilliant, ruthless, and terrifying in her efficiency. Marcus had watched her rise through the ranks, each promotion marked by longer hours, sharper suits, and an increasingly impenetrable wall between her and everyone else. The grandfather clock in the lobby chimed 10. Marcus knew Victoria's schedule by heart. She arrived at 7 every morning, left after 8 every evening, and didn't acknowledge his existence unless he failed to open the door fast enough. Today, she was in back-to-back meetings until 4:30. He had less than 7 hours to deliver this envelope. The morning passed in a blur of open doors and polite greetings. Marcus felt the envelope burning against his chest, tucked into his inner jacket pocket. Several times, he pulled it out to examine it. The paper was yellowed with age, the edges soft and frayed. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, written with what must have been a fountain pen. There was no return address, just Victoria's name and the building's address. At noon, Victoria swept through the lobby with her usual entourage. Her black Armani suit was immaculate, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that accentuated her sharp cheekbones. She was on her phone, speaking in rapid-fire sentences about quarterly projections and market volatility. Her assistant, a nervous young man named Brian, struggled to keep pace while juggling her coffee, briefcase, and tablet. Marcus stepped forward, the envelope in his hand. "Miss Ashford," he began. She didn't even glance at him. Her phone conversation continued without pause as she strode past, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and cold air in her wake. Brian shot Marcus an apologetic look but hurried after his boss, disappearing into the elevator bank. Marcus stood there, envelope still extended, feeling the weight of the strange woman's words. Before 5 o'clock. Her destiny depends on it. And yours. He returned to his post, but the ease that usually characterized his work had vanished. Every time the elevator dinged, he looked up, hoping to see Victoria. The afternoon stretched on. At 3 o'clock, he tried again. Victoria was returning from a lunch meeting, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome of ambition. "Miss Ashford, please, I have something for you." This time, she did look at him. Her gray eyes were ice chips, her expression one of barely contained irritation. "Whatever you're selling, Marcus, I'm not interested. And I'd appreciate it if you'd remember your place." The word struck him like a physical blow. In 32 years, she had never even used his name. He hadn't realized she knew it. But her tone made it clear that knowing his name and caring about him as a person were two entirely different things. It's not that, Miss Ashford. Someone left this for you. It seems important. Victoria's gaze flicked to the envelope, then back to his face. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I receive dozens of packages every day. That's what Brian is for. Give it to him. But ma'am, she was already walking away, her phone back at her ear, her attention already on the next deal, the next meeting, the next conquest. Marcus watched her disappear into the elevator, and for the first time in 3 decades, he felt anger simmer in his chest. The clock struck 4. 1 hour left. Marcus looked at the envelope again. He could leave it at the security desk. He could give it to Brian. He could follow protocol and simply forget about the strange woman's warning. But something in his gut told him that would be a mistake. That this moment mattered in ways he couldn't yet understand. He made a decision that could cost him his job. He took off his cap, straightened his shoulders, and walked to the elevator bank. The security guard called after him, asking where he was going, but Marcus didn't stop. He pressed the button. For the 42nd floor, where Ashford and Chen had their executive offices. The elevator ride felt eternal. Marcus had been in this building for 3 decades but had never been to the executive floors. That wasn't his world. His world was the lobby, the revolving door, the boundary between outside and inside. But today, he was crossing a different kind of threshold. The elevator doors opened onto a realm of hushed luxury. Deep carpets absorbed sound. Original artwork hung on walls painted in sophisticated grays and blues. The receptionist, a woman with perfect makeup and a practiced smile, looked at him with undisguised surprise. "Can I help you?" Marcus straightened his uniform. "I need to see Miss Ashford." "It's urgent." The receptionist's smile turned patronizing. "Miss Ashford is in a meeting. If you have a delivery, you can leave it with me. I need to give this to her personally. Please. It's important." "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your post. If you don't, I'll need to call security." Marcus felt the envelope in his hands. 4:15. 45 minutes left. He thought about the elderly woman's face, the desperate urgency in her voice. He thought about destiny, about the idea that some moments in life were hinges on which everything turned. He walked past the receptionist's desk. "Sir." "Stop." He didn't stop. He followed the hallway, reading the nameplates on doors, ignoring the receptionist's protests behind him. Victoria Ashford, Senior Vice President. The door was closed. He could hear voices inside, the murmur of a meeting in progress. He knocked. The voices stopped. The door opened. Brian stood there, his face registering shock. "Marcus? I need to give this to Miss Ashford. Now." "You can't just," Marcus pushed past him. The conference room was all glass and steel, with a view of the city that took his breath away. Victoria sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by 8 men in expensive suits. Every face turned toward him, expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. Victoria's face went white, then red. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus walked to her, his legs shaking but his resolve firm. He placed the envelope on the table in front of her. "A woman gave this to me this morning. She said it was urgent. That your destiny depends on it. I tried to give it to you 3 times today, and you wouldn't even look at it." The room was silent. You could hear the rain against the windows, the distant hum of the city below. One of the men at the table cleared his throat. "Victoria, should I call security?" Victoria stared at the envelope. Marcus watched her face change, watched something flicker in those cold gray eyes. Recognition? Fear? He couldn't tell. Get out, she said, her voice low and dangerous. You're fired. Get out of this building now, and don't ever come back. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd known this was a possibility. He'd thrown away 3 decades of steady employment, his pension, his reputation. For what? An envelope from a strange woman? A feeling in his gut? He turned to leave. Behind him, he heard the rustle of paper. Victoria had picked up the envelope. Wait. Marcus stopped. He didn't turn around. Everyone out, Victoria said. Meeting's over. Victoria, we're in the middle of, out. Now. There was the sound of chairs scraping, papers being gathered, confused murmurs. The executives filed past Marcus, shooting him curious and hostile glances. Brian hesitated at the door. You too, Brian. Close the door behind you. The door clicked shut. Marcus and Victoria were alone. He turned to face her. She was standing now, the envelope open in her hands, a single piece of paper visible inside. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were shaking. How did you get this? Her voice was barely a whisper. A woman gave it to me this morning. Elderly, dressed in old clothes. She was standing in the rain outside the building. She said I had to give it to you before 5 o'clock. What did she look like? Marcus tried to remember. It had all happened so fast, and the woman's face had been obscured by the rain and mist. She had dark eyes, I think. Gray hair. There was something about her that seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. Victoria sank into her chair. She read the letter again, her eyes moving over the lines slowly, as if each word was a knife. Then she looked up at Marcus, and for the first time since he'd known her, he saw her as a human being. Vulnerable. Afraid. Lost. This is my grandmother's handwriting, she said. My grandmother Rosa. She died 20 years ago. The words hung in the air. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. That's impossible. Victoria laughed, but it was a broken sound. Of course it's impossible. But this is her handwriting. I'd know it anywhere. And this, she gestured to the letter, this is about something only she and I knew about. Something I never told anyone. She stood and walked to the window, her arms wrapped around herself. When I was 18, I was accepted to art school. Full scholarship to the Rhode Island School of Design. I wanted to be a painter. I was good, Marcus. Really good. But my grandfather, he had different plans. He was grooming me to take over the firm. And my parents, they sided with him. The pressure was enormous. She paused, her reflection in the window showing a woman Marcus had never seen before. Someone young and uncertain, trapped in the armor of success. My grandmother Rosa was the only one who supported my dream. She told me to follow my heart, that money and prestige meant nothing if you spent your life doing something that killed your soul. We had this big fight, the whole family, right here in this building. I was standing in my grandfather's office, and everyone was yelling. My grandmother took my hand and said she'd support whatever decision I made. What did you choose? Marcus asked quietly. Victoria's reflection smiled, but it was the saddest smile Marcus had ever seen. I chose this. The firm. The money. The family legacy. My grandmother was so disappointed. She said something to me that day, something I never forgot. She said, one day, Vicky, you'll wake up and realize you've built a life you don't want to live. And on that day, you'll have to decide whether it's too late to change. She turned from the window, tears streaming down her face. This letter, Marcus. It's dated the day she died. 20 years ago. But it's addressed to me today. And it says, her voice broke, it says, it's not too late. The gallery called. They want to show your work. This is your second chance. Don't miss it. Marcus felt the hair on his arms stand up. What gallery? I don't know. I haven't painted in 20 years. I threw out all my work when I committed to the firm. There is no gallery. There couldn't be. Victoria's phone buzzed on the table. She ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. Finally, she picked it up. Her face went white. It's Brian. He says there's a woman downstairs. From the Castellano Gallery in Chelsea. She says she's been trying to reach me for weeks. She found some of my old college work at an estate sale and wants to meet about a show. The room seemed to tilt. Marcus gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. That's impossible. Victoria looked at the letter, then at Marcus. Her whole body was trembling. This morning, did you notice anything else about the woman? Anything at all? Marcus closed his eyes, trying to remember. She had a necklace. Silver, with a small pendant. I only noticed because it caught the light. Victoria reached into her blouse and pulled out a chain. Hanging from it was a small silver pendant, intricately carved. This? Marcus nodded, his mouth dry. Exactly like that. Victoria sank back into her chair. She gave this to me when I was 16. Said it had been in our family for generations. Said it was meant to guide us when we were lost. They sat in silence for a long moment. The rain had stopped, and weak afternoon sunlight was breaking through the clouds, painting the office in shades of gold. What time is it? Victoria asked. Marcus checked his watch. 4:55. 5 minutes. She said before 5 o'clock. Victoria stood and walked to her desk. She opened a drawer and pulled out a business card. She looked at it for a long moment, then picked up her phone. Brian? Send up the woman from the gallery. And then I want you to draft my resignation letter. Yes, I'm serious. Effective immediately. She hung up and looked at Marcus. Her eyes were red, but there was something new in them. Something that looked like hope. Thank you, she said. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you earlier. I'm sorry for how I've treated you all these years. You were invisible to me, and that's my shame to carry. Marcus felt his throat tighten. You weren't ready to see the envelope until now. Maybe that was part of it too. Victoria walked over to him. She extended her hand. He shook it, feeling the firmness of her grip, the warmth of human connection. What will you do? He asked. I don't know. Paint, maybe. Or maybe I'll discover I'm terrible at it now and have to find something else. But at least I'll be choosing. What about you? I got you fired. Marcus smiled. I'm 63 years old. I've been opening doors for other people my whole life. Maybe it's time I walked through a few of my own. The door opened. Brian stood there with a woman in her 50s, dressed in artistic black, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Miss Ashford. I'm Elena Castellano. I'm so glad I finally tracked you down. Victoria looked at Marcus one last time. He nodded. She turned to the gallery owner and extended her hand. Call me Victoria. And I'm sorry I've been so hard to reach. I've been lost for a long time. But I think I'm ready to be found. Marcus left the office. As he walked down the hallway, past the shocked receptionist, into the elevator, he felt lighter than he had in years. In the lobby, the security guard approached him nervously. Mr. Webb, I heard there was an incident. Are you all right? Marcus smiled. I'm better than all right, Tom. I'm free. He walked through the revolving door one last time, not as the doorman but as a man with his own destiny ahead of him. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The streets were washed clean, and the setting sun painted everything in shades of amber and gold. On the sidewalk, he saw something that made him stop. A small silver pendant, lying in a puddle, catching the light. He picked it up. It was identical to the one Victoria wore. But that was impossible. Unless. He looked around, searching for the elderly woman. The street was crowded with evening commuters, but none of them were her. He slipped the pendant into his pocket and started walking, not toward the subway that would take him to his small apartment in Queens, but in the opposite direction. Toward somewhere new. Toward possibility. 3 months later, Marcus stood in a small gallery in Chelsea, a glass of wine in his hand, looking at paintings that took his breath away. Victoria's work covered the walls, explosions of color and emotion that seemed to capture something essential about the human experience. The paintings were raw, honest, beautiful. They were the work of someone who had been silent for 20 years and finally found her voice. Victoria stood in the corner, surrounded by admirers and critics and buyers. She wore a simple dress instead of a suit, and her hair hung loose around her shoulders. When she saw Marcus, her face lit up, and she excused herself from the crowd. "You came," she said, embracing him like an old friend. "I wouldn't miss it. These are incredible, Victoria." She glanced at the paintings, and he saw both pride and vulnerability in her expression. "I'm terrified. What if this is all I have? What if I can't do it again? Then you'll do something else. That's what freedom is. The right to fail. The right to try again." She smiled. "When did you get so wise?" "I've had a lot of time to think lately." He'd spent the last 3 months traveling, something he'd never done before. He'd seen the ocean. Climbed a mountain. Slept under stars. He'd discovered that the world was far bigger and more beautiful than the marble lobby he'd stood in for 32 years. "Have you heard anything else?" Victoria asked quietly. "About her?" Marcus shook his head. But he'd looked. He'd researched Victoria's family history, found photos of her grandmother Rosa. The resemblance to the woman who'd given him the envelope was undeniable. But Rosa had been buried in a cemetery in Connecticut for 20 years. There was no rational explanation. "Maybe we're not supposed to understand it," he said. "Maybe some things are just meant to be mysteries." Victoria touched the pendant at her neck. "I've been thinking about that. About destiny and choice. That letter didn't force me to change. It just gave me permission to choose. The same way you chose to bring it to me, even though it could cost you everything." "Did cost me everything," Marcus corrected with a smile. "And gave you everything back." A young couple approached, asking Victoria about one of the larger paintings. She excused herself, returning to her role as artist, as creator, as someone who had found her way back to herself. Marcus wandered through the gallery, studying each painting. In one corner, he found a piece that made him stop. It was smaller than the others, more intimate. It showed a doorman in a burgundy uniform, standing in a marble lobby, holding an envelope. But the way Victoria had painted it, the doorman wasn't a servant or an invisible figure. He was a guardian. A protector. Someone who stood at the threshold between one world and another, helping others cross over. The title card read, "The Guardian of Thresholds." And underneath, in smaller text, "For Marcus, who opened the door I was afraid to walk through." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. He'd spent 32 years opening doors, but he'd never understood that he was doing something important. That every time he held the door, every time he smiled and welcomed someone, he was participating in the small acts of grace that held the world together. That evening, after the gallery had closed and the crowds had dispersed, Marcus walked through the streets of Chelsea. The pendant was still in his pocket. He'd carried it every day since finding it, waiting to understand what he was supposed to do with it. He passed a homeless man sitting against a building, holding a sign that read, "Veteran. Anything helps." The man looked broken, defeated, his eyes empty of hope. Marcus stopped. He pulled the pendant from his pocket and knelt down beside the man. The man flinched, expecting criticism or violence. Instead, Marcus placed the pendant in his weathered hand. "Someone gave this to me when I needed it," Marcus said. "Maybe you need it now." The man stared at the pendant, then at Marcus. "What is it?" "I think it's a reminder. That it's never too late. That our stories aren't finished until we decide they are." The man's eyes filled with tears. He closed his fist around the pendant and nodded, unable to speak. Marcus stood and continued walking. Behind him, he heard the man call out, "Thank you. God bless you." Marcus didn't turn around. He just lifted his hand in acknowledgement and kept walking, into the evening, into whatever came next. Years later, when Marcus was 70 and living in a small coastal town where he volunteered at the local library, he would sometimes think about that day. About the envelope, the strange woman, the impossible letter. He would think about Victoria, who had become a celebrated artist, whose work hung in museums and commanded high prices at auction. They still exchanged letters, old-fashioned handwritten ones, maintaining a friendship forged in that moment of crisis and transformation. But mostly, he thought about destiny. About how it wasn't a fixed path but a series of choices. About how the smallest actions could ripple outward in ways you'd never anticipate. About how sometimes, the universe sent you a message, but you had to be brave enough to listen. And you had to be brave enough to act, even when the world told you to stay in your place, to know your role, to keep your head down. He thought about thresholds. How life was full of them. Some were physical, like the revolving door he'd stood beside for 3 decades. Others were invisible, the moments when you stood between who you were and who you could become. And he thought about how he'd spent his life helping others cross those thresholds, never realizing that one day, someone would help him cross his own. On his desk in the library, Marcus kept a photograph. It showed him and Victoria at her gallery opening, both of them smiling, both of them free. And beneath it, in a frame, was a quote he'd found in one of the books he'd read during his travels: "We are all of us the guardians of each other's destinies, whether we know it or not." Sometimes, late at night, when the library was empty and the moon was full, Marcus would stand at the window and look out at the ocean. And sometimes, just sometimes, he'd see a figure standing on the beach. An elderly woman in old-fashioned clothes, watching the waves. She never came closer. She never spoke. But Marcus would raise his hand in greeting, and the woman would nod. And then she'd disappear, as mysteriously as she'd appeared that rainy morning in Manhattan, leaving nothing but the sound of the waves and the certainty that some mysteries were gifts, not problems to be solved. The envelope had been delivered. The message had been received. And 2 lives had been transformed, not by magic or miracles, but by the simple, profound act of one person seeing another person and choosing, despite everything, to care. That was destiny. Not fate or predetermination, but the choices we make when we're brave enough to believe that change is possible. That it's never too late. That we can always, always, walk through a new door. All we need is someone willing to hold it open.